There was a time when Pastor Emily Carter stood alone in the middle of a dying community farm, staring at rows of empty fields and wondering how she would tell dozens of struggling families that the fresh food they depended on was about to disappear. Instead of accepting defeat, she made a decision that sounded almost impossible. She believed a handful of local teenagers could save what generations of adults no longer could. People smiled politely, shook their heads, and whispered that she was wasting her time, convinced today's students cared more about their phones than their neighbors. But while searching through the old church, Emily uncovered something hidden for decades. Something that revealed the farm had survived impossible times before, and the truth behind it would change the entire town forever. Before we uncover that secret, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I hope you're having a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening wherever you may be. If you enjoy heartfelt stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next journey together. The morning mist still clung to the fields when Pastor Emily Carter pushed open the weathered gate to Willow Creek Community Farm. Dew sparkled across rows of lettuce and beans that should have looked full of promise, yet too many beds sat empty, covered only by dry weeds and cracked soil. She paused for a moment, breathing in the familiar scent of damp earth, and memories of helping her father on their small family farm drifted back. As a little girl, she had believed every sunrise meant another chance to grow something good. After her father passed away, she had left farming behind for seminary, never imagining that years later she would once again find herself standing in a field before most of the town had even awakened. "Morning, Pastor," Harold Benson called, raising one gloved hand as he slowly pulled a wagon loaded with baskets. At 72, he still arrived before anyone else, but his shoulders bent lower than they had only a year earlier. Emily hurried over and took the wagon from him without a word. "You shouldn't be lifting this alone," she said gently. Harold smiled. "If I wait for younger backs, these vegetables might never reach the pantry." The joke landed softly because both of them knew it wasn't really a joke anymore. Only 5 other volunteers had arrived, every one of them well past retirement age. They worked carefully, stopping often to rest, yet refusing to complain. Emily joined them, picking tomatoes, tying loose vines, and carrying crates toward the old barn. The work was steady, but the silence between conversations felt heavier than the baskets they carried. By mid-morning, Sarah Lopez pulled into the gravel driveway with the food pantry van. She climbed out, carrying a clipboard, and offered Emily a grateful smile before looking across the fields. "This is everything for today?" she asked quietly. Emily nodded. "I'm afraid so," Sarah sighed. "The pantry shelves empty faster every week. More families are asking for fresh produce than ever before. Without this farm—" She stopped herself, unwilling to finish the sentence. Harold answered instead, "Without this farm, a lot of tables will be missing vegetables before the month is over." Emily helped load the crates into the van. She watched Sarah carefully arrange every box, treating each tomato and squash as though it mattered because it did. It did matter. Some families depended on these deliveries to stretch grocery budgets that had already reached their limits. After the van disappeared down the road, Emily wandered toward the neglected fields at the edge of the property. Tall weeds had replaced rows that once produced corn, peppers, and pumpkins. An old wooden sign leaned sideways, faded by decades of weather. She could almost picture children laughing during harvest festivals she had heard older church members describe. Now only the wind moved through the empty rows. Near the barn entrance hung a collection of framed photographs. Emily brushed dust from one of them. Dozens of smiling volunteers stood shoulder to shoulder, young and old together, filling nearly the entire field behind them. Another photograph showed tractors, school children, church groups, and families gathering around overflowing harvest tables. "There used to be hundreds," Harold said as he stepped beside her. "Every Saturday." "You could hardly find a place to park." Emily looked from the photographs back to the quiet farm. "What changed?" Harold stared across the land for a long moment. "Life got busy. People got older. One by one, they stopped coming." His voice softened. "And now, I don't think we can keep this place going much longer." The words settled over Emily like the morning fog returning. She wanted to argue, but the empty fields and tired faces had already spoken for him. Late that afternoon, as the volunteers prepared to leave, Emily found an official envelope tucked beneath the church mail waiting on the farmhouse porch. She unfolded the letter slowly, her eyes stopping on one sentence that made her chest tighten. "Guess the farm secured enough active workers within the next few weeks. Operations would be suspended indefinitely." She lowered the page and looked across the quiet fields, wondering how she could possibly keep a place alive when there were barely enough hands left to harvest what still remained. The letter remained folded inside Emily Carter's Bible the next morning, its warning impossible to ignore. After finishing the church's weekly prayer gathering, she set out across Willow Creek, determined to ask for help before accepting defeat. Her first stop was the home of Walter and Helen Briggs, a retired couple who had volunteered at the community farm for decades. Walter welcomed her onto the porch with a warm smile, but when she explained the situation, his expression slowly faded. "If these knees were 20 years younger," he said, patting one leg, "I'd already be out there." Helen reached for Emily's hand. "We still love that farm. Pastor, we just can't do what we used to." Emily thanked them and continued through town, visiting shop owners, longtime church members, and former volunteers. Every conversation carried the same mixture of affection and regret. People remembered picking vegetables with their parents, harvest festivals filled with music, and truckloads of fresh produce delivered to families in need. Yet every story ended with another reason they could no longer help. Some were caring for aging spouses. Others worked 2 jobs just to pay bills. A few simply admitted they no longer had the strength. By lunchtime, Emily had collected plenty of memories, but not a single new volunteer. She stopped by the food pantry where Sarah Lopez was sorting donated canned goods. The shelves looked thinner than usual. "We're stretching everything," Sarah admitted. "Fresh vegetables disappear the same day they arrive. Families ask if we'll have more next week, and I honestly don't know what to tell them anymore." Emily glanced toward the nearly empty produce section. "If the farm closes..." Sarah nodded before she could finish. "I know." The silence between them spoke louder than either woman could. Before leaving, Emily promised she would keep searching for an answer, though she was becoming less certain one existed. That evening, after the church's community supper, several members gathered to discuss the farm. Martha Green folded her arms as Emily explained the official notice. "We've all done what we can," Martha said. "Maybe it's time to accept that some things simply come to an end." Emily understood the practical side of Martha's words, but they still hurt. "The farm feeds people," she replied quietly. "If it disappears, families lose more than a garden." Martha sighed. "I know what it means. I'm only saying we can't ask exhausted people to carry more than they already do." No one argued. Several heads lowered in reluctant agreement. Later that night, Emily unlocked the church office and carried a small box of old record books into the fellowship hall. If she couldn't immediately find workers, perhaps she could understand how earlier generations had kept the farm alive. Dust floated through the light as she opened decades-old folders containing meeting notes, faded newsletters, handwritten donation lists, and yellowed photographs. Again and again she found references to the community farm, each describing neighbors working side by side during difficult years. One handwritten church report caught her attention. It mentioned that the farm's founding pastor had recorded the early history in a personal journal so future generations would remember why the land mattered. Emily searched the shelves again, then checked nearby storage cabinets, but the journal wasn't there. She found only a small card listing church archives with one item marked simply as Founder's Journal, location unknown. She traced the words with her finger, wondering how something so important had vanished. The following afternoon, she stopped at Willow Creek High School to meet Principal David Ross about a food drive. After discussing the pantry's needs, he listened carefully as she described the farm's struggle. "Have you thought about involving students?" he asked. Emily smiled politely. "Honestly, I don't know if they'd be interested in spending weekends pulling weeds." David leaned back. "You might be surprised. A lot of them need meaningful service hours before graduation. They also need something that feels real." Emily wasn't convinced. She pictured teenagers scrolling through phones rather than harvesting vegetables beneath the summer sun. Still, she agreed to let him mention the opportunity. As she prepared to leave, a tall senior wearing a backpack stepped into the office to deliver paperwork. "Jake," Principal Ross said, "this is Pastor Emily. She's looking for volunteers at the community farm." Jake glanced at Emily, then shrugged. "I guess I could stop by once. I still need service hours." Emily thanked him, unsure whether one reluctant student could possibly change anything. But as Jake walked away, she realized it was the first yes she had heard all week. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and little expectation. Emily unlocked the gate to the community farm before sunrise, wondering whether Jake Morrison had only agreed to be polite. Harold Benson was already filling watering cans while the familiar group of older volunteers slowly gathered near the barn. They exchanged hopeful glances each time a vehicle passed, but for nearly half an hour no one turned into the gravel driveway. Then an aging pickup rolled through the entrance. Jake climbed out, hands shoved into his pockets, followed by 3 classmates who looked only slightly more enthusiastic. One of them, a cheerful girl with a camera slung over her shoulder, introduced herself as Mia Brooks. Another boy stretched dramatically, as if he had already finished a long day of work. Emily smiled warmly. "I'm glad you came." Jake shrugged. "We said we'd help for a while." Harold handed each of them a pair of work gloves. "Then let's get started." The first hour was anything but smooth. None of the students knew how to harvest vegetables without damaging the plants. Jake accidentally pulled up an entire lettuce head before it had matured. One classmate stacked tomato crates so carelessly that several rolled into the dirt. Mia admitted she had never held a garden hoe before. Harold corrected mistakes patiently, though Emily could see the extra effort tiring him. Rather than standing back and giving instructions, Emily worked beside the students. She knelt in the soil, demonstrated how to loosen weeds around fragile roots, and laughed when her own boots became coated with mud. Seeing their pastor doing the same difficult jobs made the students noticeably more comfortable asking questions. "So you've really done this before?" Jake asked while trying to straighten a crooked row of bean plants. Emily smiled. "Long before I ever stood behind a church pulpit." She briefly told him about growing up on her family's small farm and how those mornings had taught her that serving others often began with ordinary work. Jake listened without replying, but his movements became more careful as he continued harvesting. By late morning, the students were sweating, tired, and surprised by how much effort even a small section of the farm required. During a short break beneath an old oak tree, Mia lifted her phone and began recording short videos of Harold explaining how fresh vegetables reached families through the local pantry. She also filmed Emily laughing with volunteers while washing dirt from freshly picked carrots. "People should see this," Mia said. Most of my friends have no idea this place even exists. Harold chuckled. Years ago, everyone knew. After lunch, Harold invited the students into an old greenhouse that had not been used in several seasons. Dust covered broken benches, and vines crept through cracked window panes. Emily looked around sadly. I didn't realize this was still here. Harold brushed debris from an old shelf. This greenhouse used to grow thousands of seedlings every spring. As they cleared away loose boards, Jake discovered a metal filing cabinet tucked into one corner. Its drawers resisted at first, but finally slid open. Inside were weathered planting schedules, volunteer sign-in sheets, and crop records dating back decades. Emily carefully flipped through the papers. One page listed nearly 100 volunteers assigned to a single spring weekend. Another recorded harvest totals that far exceeded anything the farm now produced. Mia looked around the empty greenhouse. It's hard to believe all those people worked here. They did, Harold replied quietly. Neighbors didn't wait to be asked twice. Emily noticed the students studying the records with genuine curiosity. The farm was becoming more than just a place to earn service hours. It was beginning to tell its own story. The afternoon passed more smoothly. Jake figured out the best way to carry heavy baskets without bruising the vegetables. He even showed another student how to tie tomato vines after watching Harold demonstrate only once. Emily caught Harold's smile into himself as he watched the teenagers working together. It was the first time she had seen that expression in days. Before leaving, Mia stood near the entrance and recorded one final clip showing the volunteers loading fresh produce into storage. I'm posting this tonight, she said. Maybe a few people will notice. No one expected much. Willow Creek was a small town, and countless videos disappeared online every day without anyone paying attention. Emily thanked each student for giving up part of their Saturday. Jake nodded. It wasn't as bad as I thought. Harold laughed. That's about the highest compliment a farmer can hope for, as the students drove away. Emily locked the barn feeling lighter than she had since receiving the closure notice. They had not solved the farm's problems, but they had accomplished more in one day than she had imagined possible. That evening, while preparing notes for Sunday's service, her phone vibrated repeatedly with notifications. Curious, she opened the screen and found message after message linking to Mia's video. Views were climbing far faster than anyone in Willow Creek would have expected, and comments from people beyond the town were beginning to appear by Monday morning. Mia Brooks's video had spread far beyond the handful of friends she expected would watch it. Church members mentioned it after the morning prayer service. Parents shared it with neighbors, and even Sarah Lopez smiled as she told Emily that people arriving at the food pantry were asking how they could help the community farm. Emily was grateful but cautious. A popular video did not automatically mean willing hands. She had learned that hope needed more than kind words. Still, when Saturday arrived again, the sound of vehicles turning onto the gravel driveway began much earlier than usual. Jake stepped out first, this time without needing encouragement from Principal Ross. Behind him came several classmates carrying work gloves, water bottles, and wide-brimmed hats. Mia followed with her camera, waving cheerfully as more students arrived in pairs. Harold stood beside the barn, blinking in surprise as he counted nearly 20 young volunteers gathering near the entrance. I haven't seen this many people here in years, he murmured. Emily felt a smile spread across her face. Let's make good use of them. The morning quickly became a lesson in teamwork. The older volunteers divided the students into small groups and patiently demonstrated everything from planting seedlings to repairing irrigation lines. Harold showed Jake how to judge whether tomatoes were ready for harvest with nothing more than a gentle touch. Martha Green, who had once questioned whether teenagers would ever care enough to help, reluctantly taught Mia and two younger students how to sort vegetables without bruising them. At first, Martha corrected every mistake with a stern expression. But before long, she caught herself laughing when one boy accidentally covered his boots with mud while trying to fill watering cans. Emily noticed the change and quietly smiled. Instead of standing apart, generations worked shoulder to shoulder. Conversations replaced the silence that had settled over the farm only a week earlier. During lunch beneath the old oak tree, Mia recorded short interviews with volunteers. She asked Harold why he had spent so many years caring for the farm. "Because somebody once did the same for my family," he answered simply. She filmed Martha explaining her favorite recipes using fresh vegetables from the harvest. She even convinced Jake to admit with an embarrassed grin that the work was harder but far more satisfying than he had expected. Before sunset, she posted another video highlighting not only the farm, but also the friendships forming there. Over the next several days, Emily noticed the results. A local hardware store donated shovels, wheelbarrows, and replacement hoses after seeing Mia's posts. A nearby garden center delivered trays of vegetable seedlings that otherwise would have been discarded. Anonymous envelopes containing small donations appeared in the church mailbox with brief notes wishing the volunteers well. None of the gifts solved every problem, but each reminded Emily that people were paying attention. The neglected greenhouse also began to change. Students swept broken glass, repaired benches, and organized the old planting records Jake had discovered. While helping sort dusty boxes stored nearby, Emily found another faded inventory sheet from decades earlier. Scribbled in one corner was a brief note mentioning that several historical church items, including personal writings from the founding pastor, had once been moved for safekeeping beneath the original church building. She paused, reading the line twice. The missing journal might not have disappeared after all. It simply might have been forgotten. That evening she mentioned the discovery to Harold as they locked the greenhouse. He nodded thoughtfully. "The old basement hasn't been used much since the church was renovated. There could still be boxes nobody has opened in years." Emily tucked the paper carefully into her notebook. It wasn't proof, but it was the strongest clue she had found since beginning her search. The following Saturday brought another busy morning. More volunteers arrived, and the fields slowly regained signs of life. Fresh seedlings filled empty rows that had stood abandoned only weeks earlier. Sarah loaded noticeably fuller crates into the pantry van and thanked everyone before driving away. Emily watched the volunteers working together and felt something she had not allowed herself to feel since opening the official closure notice: genuine hope. As the afternoon sun grew hotter, Harold insisted on helping move several heavy irrigation pipes, despite Jake offering to handle them. Emily reminded him to rest, but Harold only smiled and said he still had a little strength left. Moments later, while carrying one end of the final pipe across the field, he suddenly stopped. His face lost its color. The pipe slipped from his hands as he staggered forward, and before anyone could reach him, Harold collapsed onto the ground. For several seconds after Harold collapsed, no one moved. Then Emily dropped to her knees beside him, while Jake shouted for someone to call an ambulance. Harold's eyes fluttered open, but his face remained pale and his breathing shallow. "I'm fine," he whispered, trying to sit up. Emily pressed a hand gently against his shoulder. "No, you're not. Stay still." The students gathered at a distance, their earlier excitement replaced by frightened silence. Martha stood beside Mia, gripping the girl's hand as the sound of sirens finally approached across Willow Creek. At the hospital, doctors explained that Harold had suffered severe exhaustion and dehydration. He would recover, but only if he rested and stopped pushing himself beyond his limits. Emily sat beside his bed after the others left, watching the man who had carried the farm for years struggle to accept that his body could no longer do what his heart demanded. "I should have listened," Harold said quietly. "You should have trusted us," Emily replied, He looked toward the window. "I didn't know if there would be an us when I stepped away." The words stayed with her long after she returned to the church. Without Harold, the farm felt suddenly fragile again. He had remembered where tools belonged, which rows needed water, and how to solve problems before anyone else noticed them. Emily feared that one bad week could undo everything they had begun. The next morning, however, Jake arrived at the farm before she did. He had copied the planting schedules from the greenhouse records and divided the students into teams. One group repaired irrigation lines, another weeded the vegetable beds, and a third prepared crates for the pantry. "Harold showed us enough to keep going," Jake said when Emily approached. "We just have to pay attention." His confidence surprised her. Only 2 weeks earlier, he had come reluctantly for service hours. Now he checked every row twice and corrected mistakes without embarrassing anyone. Mia documented less and worked more, setting down her camera whenever extra hands were needed. Martha brought cold water and sandwiches, then remained to teach students how to identify damaged plants. When one teenager apologized for working too slowly, she shook her head. "Slow and careful is better than fast and careless." Emily recognized the change in her voice. The skepticism was gone. By midday, the farm was running without Harold for the first time in years. Not perfectly, but together. Emily visited him again that afternoon and described what the students had accomplished. Harold closed his eyes briefly, relief softening his face. Jake stepped up. "He did." "And Martha didn't chase them all away," Emily laughed. "She may be their strongest defender now," Harold smiled, but his eyes grew wet. "Maybe I held on so tightly because I was afraid nobody would care after me." Emily reached for his hand. "They care because you showed them why it matters." Later, back at the church, Emily opened her notebook and reread the faded inventory note about historical items stored beneath the original building. The clue felt more urgent now. Harold's collapse had reminded her that the farm's future could not depend on one person's memory. If the founding pastor's journal still existed, perhaps it held something the town needed to hear. She found Martha in the fellowship hall and asked about the old basement. "Most people avoid it," Martha said. "Low ceiling, damp walls, boxes everywhere. The renovation crew left half the storage untouched." Together they unlocked a narrow door behind the church kitchen and descended a steep wooden staircase. Dust coated the floor, and the single hanging bulb flickered as Emily pulled its cord. Shelves leaned beneath old hymnals, account books, broken decorations, and church records wrapped in yellowing paper. They searched until evening, opening one box after another. Emily found baptism lists, handwritten sermons, and photographs of the farm's earliest harvests, but no journal. Martha was ready to stop when Emily noticed scrape marks beneath a stack of folded tables. Jake, who had come to deliver the day's harvest report, helped move them aside. Behind the tables sat a small wooden chest darkened by age. Its brass lock was stiff but not secured. Emily knelt and lifted the lid. Inside, beneath a folded cloth, lay a thick, leather-bound book. She opened the cover carefully and read the handwritten words on the first page. "The founding of Willow Creek Community Farm." Emily carried the leather-bound journal upstairs as carefully as if it might crumble in her hands. In the quiet fellowship hall, she, Martha, and Jake gathered around a table while the old pages released the faint smell of dust and damp paper. The founding pastor's handwriting was narrow but steady, and the earliest entry was dated nearly 70 years before. Emily began reading aloud. The town had been suffering through an economic collapse that closed local businesses, emptied savings accounts, and left families choosing between food and heating their homes. The church had owned several neglected acres beside the creek, and the pastor had proposed turning them into a shared farm. There had been no money for equipment, almost no seed, and no experienced manager. What the town did have was labor. One family brought a plow. Another donated seeds saved from the previous harvest. Widows prepared meals for workers. Children carried water. Men who had lost their jobs dug rows beside shop owners whose businesses were failing. The journal described how people worked not because they expected payment, but because someone nearby needed food. They built the farm with almost nothing. Jake said, "Not nothing," Martha replied softly. "They had each other." Emily continued through later entries. Every generation had faced a different crisis. Drought had once ruined half the crops. A flood had damaged the barn. Years of low harvests had nearly forced the farm to close. Each time, residents renewed the same promise. No family in Willow Creek would face hardship alone while the land could still produce food. Tucked between 2 pages, Emily found a folded sheet bearing dozens of faded signatures. At the top was a handwritten pledge. "We offer our hands, our time, and what we can spare, so this farm may serve every neighbor who needs it." Jake traced the names without touching the fragile paper. Some belonged to families he recognized from school. Others appeared on storefronts, street signs, and grave markers throughout town. "Nobody ever told us this," he said. Emily thought of the missing volunteers, the neglected greenhouse, and Harold lying in a hospital bed because he believed the farm depended on him alone. The journal revealed that it never had. Its survival had always depended on ordinary people choosing, again and again, to carry the burden together. The following Sunday, Emily placed the journal on the pulpit rather than opening her Bible first. The sanctuary was filled with church members, students, older volunteers, and several families who received food from the pantry. Sarah sat near the front beside Mia and Jake. Martha had brought Harold by car after receiving his doctor's permission, though she made him sit and promised to return him home immediately afterward. Emily told the congregation about the economic collapse, the donated seeds, and the families who had worked without knowing whether their efforts would succeed. She read the original pledge aloud. No one shifted or whispered. Even the students who usually glanced at their phones listened closely. "The people who started our farm were not stronger than we are," Emily said. "They were frightened, tired, and uncertain. They simply understood that survival was not one person's responsibility." Harold lowered his head, emotion tightening his face. Emily looked toward him. "Every generation renewed this promise. Now it has reached us." After the service, the congregation gathered at the community farm. Mia displayed copies of old photographs beside images of the students repairing the greenhouse. Jake read names from the pledge while descendants stepped forward in surprise. Several older residents shared memories of parents and grandparents working the fields. What had seemed like forgotten history became personal again. The students no longer spoke about required service hours. They asked Harold which crops should be planted next and how the greenhouse could be restored before spring. Sarah explained how each harvest reached the pantry, and volunteers began planning regular work shifts instead of isolated visits. Emily watched the farm fill with voices and felt the legacy moving from the journal into living hands. Near sunset, Harold stood beside her at the edge of the field. "I spent years believing I had to protect this place," he said. "Maybe I should have remembered the promise." "You kept it alive long enough for everyone else to remember," Emily answered. Dark clouds had gathered beyond the western hills while they spoke. The wind changed suddenly, bending the young plants and carrying the sharp scent of rain. Mia checked the weather alert on her phone, and the color drained from her face. A severe storm was moving directly toward Willow Creek, with damaging winds expected before midnight. Across the farm, volunteers turned toward the blackening sky as the first heavy drops struck the dry earth. The first gust struck before the volunteers reached the barn. Rain swept across the fields in hard, diagonal sheets, flattening young plants and turning the paths into slick ribbons of mud. Emily shouted for everyone to move quickly, and Jake began directing students toward the most vulnerable rows. Some carried tarps from the greenhouse, while others secured loose tools and empty crates before the wind could scatter them. Harold protested when Martha tried to guide him toward her car. "I can still help," he insisted. "You just left the hospital," she snapped. "Then give me something that doesn't require lifting." Emily handed him the planting records and asked him to identify which beds needed protection first. From beneath the barn awning, Harold called instructions while the students worked through the downpour. They covered seedlings, reinforced the greenhouse door, and dragged sandbags toward the lowest section of the property. Lightning flashed beyond the creek, followed almost instantly by thunder. Mia slipped while carrying a tarp, and Jake caught her arm before she fell into a flooded furrow. "Forget the camera," he said. "I already did," she answered, tightening her grip on the canvas. For nearly an hour they fought the storm, but the wind became too dangerous. Emily finally ordered everyone inside the barn. They stood, soaked and shivering as rain hammered the roof. Through the open doorway, she watched water collect between the rows and felt helplessness rise in her chest. The farm had only begun to recover. Now weeks of work could disappear before morning. Harold seemed to read her expression. "Storms don't ask whether you're ready," he said. "You save what you can, then you begin again." By dawn, the worst had passed. The volunteers stepped outside into a landscape that looked wounded. Several vegetable beds were underwater. Tomato supports lay twisted in the mud. Part of the greenhouse roof had torn away, and broken branches covered the road toward the pantry loading area. Sarah arrived soon afterward and stopped beside Emily, staring at the damage. "How much did we lose?" she asked. Emily could not answer. Harold moved carefully through the fields, checking plants one row at a time while Jake recorded his observations. Some crops had been destroyed, but others might survive if drained and supported quickly. The problem was the scale of the work. Their small group could not clear debris, repair structures, and rescue the remaining vegetables before more rain arrived. Emily gathered everyone near the barn. Mud covered their clothes, exhaustion marked their faces, and for the first time since the students joined, no one spoke with confidence. "We may have asked too much of you," she said. "No," Jake replied immediately. He looked at his classmates. "We came here to save the farm. That doesn't only count when the weather is good." He divided the students into teams just as he had when Harold was hospitalized. One group dug channels to drain standing water. Another lifted fallen supports and tied damaged plants upright. Mia and Martha sorted usable supplies inside the greenhouse, while Sarah contacted pantry volunteers for extra hands. Jake moved constantly between them, asking Harold for guidance and repeating instructions clearly. Emily joined the drainage team. But each time she looked across the ruined beds, doubt returned. Even if they saved part of the harvest, the closure deadline still hung over them. Tools and good intentions could not replace long-term workers. Around midday, Emily sat alone on an overturned crate, her gloves heavy with mud. "Maybe Martha was right," she admitted when Harold approached. "Maybe some things simply come to an end." Harold lowered himself beside her. "That journal didn't promise the farm would never be damaged. It promised people would not face hardship alone." He nodded toward the field. Students, church members, pantry volunteers, and older residents were working in the same mud. "Look before you decide you failed." Emily watched Jake lift a broken beam with two classmates. She saw Mia give her dry jacket to a younger volunteer. Martha, who had once doubted them all, carried water from person to person and scolded anyone who tried to skip a rest. The storm had damaged the farm, but it had not scattered the people. By late afternoon, more vehicles began arriving. Harold had called former volunteers. Sarah had contacted pantry families. Mia had posted a brief message showing the damage and asking for help. Neighbors came with chainsaws, shovels, boots, and food. Together they cleared the road, reopened drainage channels, and saved several rows that had seemed lost that morning. As evening approached, Emily stood beside Jake in the battered greenhouse. "You kept everyone moving," she said. He shrugged, though pride showed in his tired face. "Harold taught me what to watch for. You taught us why it mattered." Outside, a car with a regional newspaper logo turned onto the gravel driveway. A reporter stepped out, lifted a camera toward the muddy crowd, and began walking toward the farm. The reporter introduced herself as Linda Foster from the regional newspaper and spent the morning walking through the muddy fields instead of standing safely beside them. Rather than beginning with questions, she watched students shovel soaked soil, older volunteers straighten broken fencing, and Sarah Lopez load salvaged vegetables into the pantry van. Emily appreciated that. The story was not about one dramatic moment, but about hundreds of ordinary acts of service. When Linda finally approached Emily, her notebook remained closed. "Why are all these teenagers here on a weekend after a storm?" she asked. Emily looked toward Jake, who was showing younger volunteers how to secure damaged tomato vines, exactly as Harold had taught him. "Because someone believed they would care," she answered. "And because they discovered this farm belongs to all of us." Linda interviewed Harold next. He leaned against the barn, still under strict instructions from Martha not to lift anything heavier than a clipboard. "I thought my generation might be the last to keep this place alive," he admitted. "Turns out we were only keeping it alive long enough to hand it over before leaving." Linda photographed students and longtime volunteers standing together in front of the greenhouse. 2 days later, the article appeared both in print and online. Instead of focusing on storm damage, the headline celebrated a community rebuilding together across generations. Mia shared the article through her growing social media pages, and the response reached beyond Willow Creek. During the following week, vehicles bearing unfamiliar license plates rolled through the farm gate. Families from neighboring towns volunteered for a day. A retired carpenter repaired damaged greenhouse framing without accepting payment. A landscaping company donated lumber and gravel. A local hardware supplier delivered replacement fencing after reading the newspaper story. Emily greeted each visitor with gratitude, realizing the farm had become more than a local concern. The spirit described in the founding journal was spreading beyond the town where it had begun. Principal David Ross visited the farm with several teachers one afternoon. He watched students working confidently beside Harold and smiled. "I've never seen some of these kids this engaged in anything outside the classroom," he told Emily. Jake was explaining irrigation schedules to younger volunteers, while Mia organized planting supplies instead of filming every task. "This has become more than service hours," David continued. "I'd like the school to create a permanent volunteer partnership with the farm. Different student groups could rotate throughout the year." Emily's face brightened. "That would give the farm dependable help, and it would give students something equally valuable," he replied. Within days, David began discussing the proposal with faculty and parents. The idea spread quickly through the school. Encouraged by students who had already experienced the work firsthand, at the farm, routines became more organized. Weekly volunteer schedules replaced last-minute requests. Experienced students trained newcomers before Harold even needed to speak. Martha coordinated meals for workdays, quietly treating every volunteer like family. Sarah reported that the pantry was once again receiving enough fresh produce to serve households that had recently gone without. The recovery remained incomplete, but the direction had changed. One evening, Harold slowly walked through the greenhouse with Emily. New seedlings filled benches that had stood empty only weeks before. Sunlight filtered through repaired glass, warming the fresh rose.
I used to dream about seeing young people take over this place.
Harold said, I just never expected it to happen while I was still around to witness it. Emily smiled. Maybe you needed to see it. Harold nodded thoughtfully. Maybe they needed someone willing to believe in them first. Emily thought about the journal resting safely inside the church office. Every generation had renewed the promise in its own way. The current chapter looked different, filled with smartphones, school schedules, and online videos. Yet the heart of the promise remained unchanged. People were still offering their hands because neighbors needed them. Late that week, Emily received a phone call from the county administration office. After reviewing the newspaper coverage and hearing from local organizations, county officials wanted to visit the community farm to discuss its future and explore possible long-term support. She thanked the caller, then quietly lowered the phone. The volunteers had saved the harvest for now, but the farm's lasting future might soon depend on what happened at that meeting. County officials arrived on a bright autumn morning, their vehicles rolling slowly through the entrance to the community farm. Emily welcomed them beside the restored greenhouse, while Harold, leaning comfortably on a walking stick, stood nearby with Martha and Sarah. Jake gathered several student volunteers, each wearing work gloves instead of school uniforms. The visitors expected a presentation, but Emily suggested they begin with a walk through the fields. As they moved between rows of healthy vegetables, she explained how the farm supplied the food pantry every week and how volunteers had rebuilt much of the property after the recent storm. Harold pointed out sections that had once been abandoned but were now producing crops again. The officials listened carefully, asking practical questions about harvest schedules, equipment, and volunteer numbers. Sarah then led them inside the pantry. Shelves that had looked painfully bare only weeks earlier now held baskets of fresh vegetables waiting for distribution. She introduced several local families collecting groceries that morning. One mother quietly thanked the volunteers for making fresh food possible after months of stretching every dollar. An elderly man explained that the produce allowed him to afford needed medicine without skipping meals. Emily noticed one county representative writing continuously as each family spoke. These were no longer statistics. They were neighbors describing how the farm touched daily life. Back at the church fellowship hall, Emily displayed copies of the founding pastor's journal alongside the original community pledge quote. She briefly shared the story of how the farm had begun during an economic collapse nearly 70 years earlier. Built by ordinary residents donating labor instead of money, quote, the officials examined the faded signatures with genuine interest. This farm has survived because each generation accepted responsibility, Emily said. We aren't asking the county to replace that responsibility. We're asking for a partnership that helps future generations continue it. Principal David Ross then presented the school's proposal. Student volunteer teams would rotate throughout the year, allowing younger students to learn from experienced volunteers before graduating. Jake explained how the schedule would provide dependable weekly help instead of occasional workdays. Mia shared photographs documenting the farm's transformation from neglected fields to crowded volunteer mornings after the newspaper story inspired neighboring communities. Martha, once skeptical of involving teenagers, smiled as she watched the students confidently answer questions. I was wrong, she admitted to one official. These young people aren't just helping. They're preparing to lead. Harold quietly nodded in agreement. During a short break, Emily stepped outside alone. She looked across the farm, where volunteers continued working without waiting for the meeting to end. Students harvested vegetables beside retirees. Pantry workers loaded fresh produce into Sarah's van. New visitors from nearby towns repaired fencing along the western edge of the property. For the first time since receiving the closure notice, Emily realized the mission had become far larger than one church or one pastor. The community itself had accepted ownership of the promise written in the journal decades earlier. The afternoon meeting concluded with one final opportunity for public comments. Harold rose slowly, supported by his walking stick. "For years, I believed this farm depended on me," he said. "Then I became too tired to keep carrying it. What I see now proves I never carried it alone. I was simply one caretaker in a much longer story." Jake stood next. "Most of us came here because we needed service hours," he admitted. "We stayed because we found people who trusted us with something that mattered." His classmates quietly applauded. Emily spoke last. She thanked every volunteer, every donor, every family, and every student who had chosen to give time instead of excuses. Then she closed the journal and placed her hand gently on its worn cover. "This book reminds us where the farm came from," she said. "The people standing outside remind us where it's going." The county representatives exchanged thoughtful glances before promising that a formal decision regarding long-term support would be announced within days. As their vehicles disappeared down the road, silence settled briefly over the farm. No one knew what the final decision would be. The harvest continued. The pantry still depended on each delivery. And every volunteer understood that the future of Willow Creek Community Farm now rested on the answer that was still to come. The waiting proved harder than any day spent working in the fields. Volunteers continued harvesting vegetables, repairing fences, and tending the greenhouse. But every conversation eventually returned to the same question: had they done enough? Emily refused to let uncertainty slow the work. The pantry still needed fresh produce. Families still depended on weekly deliveries, and the promise written in the founding journal remained unchanged regardless of any official decision. One crisp morning, as volunteers gathered beside the barn to begin another workday, a county vehicle pulled through the entrance. The officials who stepped out wore warm smiles instead of formal expressions. Emily met them near the old oak tree where the students had once shared their first uncertain lunch together. The lead representative unfolded a document and thanked everyone for preserving a place that had become far more than a farm. After reviewing community testimony, volunteer participation, and the long history recorded in the founding journal, the county had unanimously approved a long-term partnership with Willow Creek Community Farm. Funding would help maintain equipment, repair aging structures, and support educational programs, while the farm itself would remain community-led. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then applause spread across the crowd. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes before hugging Emily. Martha laughed openly as students celebrated beside volunteers old enough to be their grandparents. Harold quietly removed his cap and looked across the fields he had feared were lost forever. Emily felt relief wash over her, not because someone else had rescued the farm, but because the town had proven it was worthy of being trusted with its future. Over the following weeks, plans quickly became reality. Principal David Ross officially launched the school's volunteer partnership. Students signed up for seasonal work rotations, learning planting, harvesting, greenhouse care, and food distribution alongside experienced volunteers. Older residents no longer worried that years of knowledge would disappear with them. They began teaching intentionally, passing along practical skills as naturally as stories. Jake helped organize the first student leadership schedule, making sure every new volunteer worked beside someone with experience. Mia continued documenting the farm, but her videos now highlighted teamwork instead of crisis. They showed younger children planting seeds, retirees explaining irrigation methods, and pantry volunteers loading fresh produce for families across Willow Creek. Businesses that had first offered one-time donations returned with ongoing support, providing tools, lumber, and supplies as needed. The greenhouse, once abandoned beneath dust and broken glass, became a place filled with seedlings and conversation. One afternoon, Harold slowly walked its length with Emily. Sunlight poured through the repaired windows onto neat rows of healthy plants. "I think it's time," he said quietly. Emily understood before he explained. A few days later, the community gathered inside the barn for a simple ceremony. Harold officially stepped down as manager of the community farm. There were no speeches about achievements or personal sacrifices. Instead, he thanked every person who had carried a shovel, planted a seed, repaired a fence, or packed vegetables for the pantry. "This farm never belonged to me," he said. "It belonged to every hand willing to serve." He handed Jake the old clipboard that had accompanied him through countless harvests. "Keep learning," he said with a smile, "and someday hand it to someone else." Jake accepted it with quiet respect rather than excitement, understanding that he was receiving responsibility more than recognition. As autumn reached its peak, Willow Creek held its annual harvest festival on the farm for the first time in several years. Long tables filled the fields. Children played between pumpkin displays. Local musicians performed beside the restored greenhouse. And families who had once depended on pantry deliveries now volunteered to prepare meals for everyone attending. Sarah watched fresh produce being shared freely throughout the afternoon and whispered that the pantry had never entered winter in such a strong position. As the evening sun settled low across the fields, Emily carried the founding journal onto a small wooden platform. The crowd gradually grew quiet. She opened the fragile book to its final handwritten entry. The founding pastor had written that every generation would someday believe the farm's future rested on one exhausted person. Yet history repeatedly proved otherwise. Whenever neighbors chose to serve together, the land endured, families were fed, and hope returned. Emily closed the journal gently. Looking across the gathering, she saw Harold smiling peacefully, Martha laughing with students she had once doubted, Sarah surrounded by grateful families, Mia capturing moments of joy instead of emergencies, and Jake helping younger volunteers clean up before anyone asked. The farm had not been saved by one pastor, one manager, one student, or one decision. It had been renewed because ordinary people accepted the same promise their grandparents once had. Emily realized that when she first received the closure notice, she believed she had to rescue the community farm herself. Instead, her real task had been inviting others to remember who they already were. The applause that followed belonged to everyone standing in the field. As darkness settled over Willow Creek, lanterns glowed along the paths between healthy rows of vegetables. Conversations continued long after the music ended, and the community farm stood ready for another season. Its greatest harvest had never been measured in baskets or bushels. It was the renewed willingness of neighbors, young and old, together to care for one another. The journal's final lesson had become the town's living tradition once again, and the next generation had already begun writing the chapter that would follow.